Hello everyone, I'm your host Joel Brice, and welcome back to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. Over the past few weeks at Delta headquarters, we've received a growing number of emails and phone calls from concerned hunters asking about a recent North American outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza that has been detected in wild ducks and geese. Hunters have inquired about their own personal safety when hunting and for the overall health of waterfowl populations. To help address hunter concerns, I'm joined by Delta's own Dr. Chris Nicolai and Dr. Andrew Ramey. Andrew is director of the Molecular Ecology Lab at the USGS Alaska Science Center in Anchorage, Alaska. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Andy.
Yeah, well, welcome to you, Chris. So we work together, but yeah, welcome as a guest. So Andrew Ramey, can I call you Andy?
Please do.
Okay, that's what your friends and the true test is, what does your mom call you?
She calls me Andy most of the time, except when she's upset with me.
And then out comes the middle name, I suppose. So, hey, thank you for spending the time. I know there's a 3-hour time difference here, so we intentionally avoided the very early morning for you. It's spring has sprung here in North Dakota. I'd love to get a glimpse of what things look like for you in Anchorage. Describe what the temps are, snow cover. Describe your world.
So I'll be generous and say it's starting to be spring, and I can say that based on daylight. So we're starting to get some longer days now. I guess as we're past the equinox, we're probably getting just a little bit longer days than you all in North Dakota. And it's changing relatively quickly right now. So we're getting, probably about 5 more minutes of daylight per day. So every week brings a lot more daylight, which is much appreciated after a long Alaska winter. We have a pretty good snowpack. There is lots of snow and frozen water still here in Anchorage. We're getting days just above freezing. So things are starting to melt, but very slowly. We have some elevation here in Anchorage. Anchorage is bordered by the Chugach Mountains, and I'm fortunate enough to live up in those Chugach Mountains on the edge of Chugach State Park, and we have lots of snow up there still. The berms on the sides of the roads are feet tall. In fact, they're taller than I am. So we have a long way to go before summer, so to speak.
Jeez, that's amazing. Yeah, right now looking out the window, it's a snow-free parking lot, snow-free lawn at our office here. And, this particular winter, we've been in a pretty good drought here, at least in the U.S. and Canadian PPR. This part of North Dakota and south hasn't rebounded from the drought. We had more snow than the year prior, but it's going to be pretty dry in this part of the world. But as you drive north, you quickly get into better conditions, and in southern Manitoba, in that Winnipeg area, I think you're starting to talk about snow drifts and measured in feet, just like what you're describing there. So much better to the north, but we're going to be dry here again. Chris, do you concur with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pretty cool. Like Winnipeg, I think this is the 3rd deepest snow they've ever recorded there. So, yeah, not that far away. Conditions are rocking, but got to have some variability, right? We don't want to turn all them switches on in one year, right?
That's right. Drought is important, but tough, right? So it all plays a role. So let's kind of start moving down, I guess, the outline of this podcast. As I stated in the intro, Andy, there's a lot of chatter out there in the hunting community right now about recent detections of highly pathogenic avian influenza, or people call it bird flu, particularly in the United States. And so, floating around the internet right now are a growing number of images of dead snow geese and other waterfowl. And we're starting to get a lot of questions asking, 2 main questions, from hunters. Should hunters be concerned about waterfowl populations as it relates to HPAI? And the second one is, their own safety. Should they be concerned about their own safety if they're out there hunting snow geese in the field? And so, Delta's on the front edge of a lot of things. I wouldn't put us at the front edge of, high path avian influenza. So I thought it was best to bring on someone like yourself, Andy, onto the podcast and just educate our listeners on the issue. And I understand that, it's an emerging issue, things are changing. And so there's things that you either don't know or maybe shouldn't tell us, but, we'll appreciate anything you can share with us. And so thanks for coming on. But before we get going, I do always want our listeners to get to meet our guests. And for those, I'll start with Chris. And, Chris and I work in the same office. Chris is Delta's waterfowl scientist. So Chris deals with, the day-to-day goings-on of our research projects with our students, our university partnerships. But Chris also brings a pretty impressive background of Arctic field research, goose banding, and Chris, you probably have an intersect with prior avian influenza monitoring. Is that true?
Yeah, no, this is pretty fun. Andy and I have never physically crossed paths, but, I'd be willing to bet some of the swabs I've done over the years for AI have gone through his lab. And, so we've known of each other for quite a while, but yeah, I got to work, in Alaska for about 15 years on the Yukon Delta, above a place we were talking about earlier of Eisenbeck there, and, Branther, near and dear. And when the bird flu stuff started back in 06, 07, we got a pretty good chunk of money for bird flu efforts just to swab all the birds we were studying, while we were doing all our other normal stuff. And then, I worked for Fish and Wildlife Service for quite a while out in Nevada and California, and I was the local migratory bird health guy. So, I got pulled into a lot of cholera and more bird sampling for flu and stuff like that. So I've got to be around, helping to sample all these years. So I think it's pretty cool to get a guy like Andy that's one of the leading gurus with bird flu, and he happens to be a hunter. So I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So that is a great segue to Andy. Andy, I'd love to, I was telling you before we started the podcast, I asked you a few questions that I kind of regretted because I'd rather the listeners got to know some of those answers rather than just Chris and myself. So let's see if we can catch lightning in a bottle twice. But tell us about you, Andy, the person, where you grew up, your interests. Are you a waterfowl hunter? And, what got you to where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So I was born in Wisconsin, raised in Ohio, and started traveling westward for my undergraduate degree at Colorado State, where I studied both wildlife biology and fishery biology. And it was there at Colorado State that I got a summer gig working up in Alaska, and found a place that I wanted to be even more than Colorado at the time. So after graduating Colorado State, I moved up north, and I've been in here working and living in Alaska ever since. And I've worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for a couple of years at the beginning of my career, and until I landed a gig at the USGS Alaska Science Center, and I've been there ever since. And I guess my professional service here in Alaska has now been about 20 years. And I began studying avian influenza and wild birds in about 2008. So let's call it over the last 15 or so years, I've been heavily invested in researching avian influenza. Have been either a lead author or co-author on about, a little more than 40 scientific peer-reviewed products since that time on this topic. So it's something that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about. And as part of our efforts studying avian influenza, we've sampled birds really over many areas in the state. I've really been fortunate to get to see lots of different areas across Alaska, which is, of course, a very large area, very diverse area, lots of waterfowl habitats here. And as I had conveyed to you prior to the beginning of this podcast, one place near and dear to my heart is Eisenbeck Refuge. So we've been sampling birds at Eisenbeck Refuge for many years now, annually since 2011. And in addition to working at Eisenbeck every year, I also spent quite a bit of time out there with my yellow dog on personal trips, hunting waterfowl, Pacific black brant, pintail ducks, and the like. And yeah, for listeners dreaming about places far flung where there's impressive clouds of birds, I definitely recommend that you do a Google search on Isaac Refuge and learn more about one of the world's first Ramsar sites and a really fabulous wetland habitat that we have as a really valuable resource here in North America.
That's
What's pretty
impressive.
cool. Oh,
Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
insert a little thing there too. One thing that's so cool for where Andy's working, with bird flu is, the Beringia area has been, identified very early on as, the main highway for moving bird flu, from Asia to North America. So yeah, his move there was, and his background was so timely that, yeah, you're pretty much set up the rest of your career, I'd imagine, Andy.
Yeah, we've done some really great research out west on exactly the topic. You hit the nail on the head there, Chris, about the movement of influenza viruses between East Asia and North America via wild birds. And it's really been incredibly interesting to research this topic at Eisenbeck and generally Western Alaska, and then to learn more about how those viruses may or may not be dispersed further south to other areas in the US and Canada as well. As really been very fulfilling, really interesting topic to investigate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up, Chris. I maybe want to tease on that one a little bit more. So the location of Alaska is very key, as you just described. That's the kind of, if birds are going to cross hemispheres, they're going to cross into Alaska. Can you describe a little bit more of that? Like what species will cross over from Asia into North America, through Alaska, and how often does that occur?
Is this to myself or?
I'm going to ask you, Andy. Yeah, go for that.
Okay, sure. So in Alaska, a couple species that come to mind that I think are really important when it comes to the dispersal of influenza viruses would be northern pintail ducks and emperor geese. So, as I think most listeners are well aware, northern pintails are a very common duck in Western North America, northwestern North America, and some proportion of those birds move between East Asia and North America. And I don't think the proportion of birds is particularly high, but just by numbers, there's lots of pintail ducks. And so the numbers of birds crossing between East Asia and North America on any given year is probably a fairly substantial number of birds. And a time of year when birds are maybe likely to disperse viruses between continents would be fall. And fall is a particularly important time because there's all these hatchier birds being generated in the far north. And these hatchier birds don't have antibodies to influenza. They haven't been exposed to influenza in the past because, of course, they're new hatchlings or just recently fledged birds. And so these birds lead to a higher prevalence of influenza in the greater population. So as birds move and fall, particularly between continents, they may be more likely to disperse viruses at that time. Another species that might be important here at the crossroads of Western Alaska would be emperor geese. So there's a really well-described molt migration of emperor geese between Western Alaska and northeastern Russia that occurs in sort of midsummer. I think this molt migration is typical of failed breeders and juvenile birds, where they disperse from Western Alaska over to northeast Russia, change their flight feathers, and then molt back into Alaska. So again, this molt migration is occurring more or less concurrently when influenza is starting to peak annually. So I think it's a species that's really, its natural history just happens to facilitate viral dispersal. And interestingly, in both of these species, we've actually detected viruses that have clearly been moved between East Asia and North America. So I think these intercontinental migratory tendencies is really pertinent when we think of viral dispersal.
Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. The challenge for me, right, is, typically when I do a podcast, I have an expert on one subject and an expert on another. So when it comes time to ask a question, it's pretty obvious who's going to go with that one. So I'm going to have to do a little better saying Chris or saying Andy. But Chris, I'm going to bounce this one over to you. How far of a distance is that traveling between East Asia and Western Alaska?
Yeah, you're just talking. I mean, you can get into tens of miles if you really get into the Bering Straits there with the Diomede Islands and all that. But yeah, and they take the shortest route. You're probably talking what, under 100 miles, Andy, 80 miles if you're talking mainland to mainland. You don't want to bring in Sarah Palin's version, I guess, but it goes pretty quick. But some of the neat stuff there Andy was bringing up too. Back before Andy's time in Alaska, I got a couple recoveries of pintails of mine in Japan. I was marking on the Yukon Delta, and people either hunt them in East Asia. Or I think one actually got recaptured, and a bunch of Andy's colleagues got sent over there for years and years. And were you there early enough to get over on some of those trips, Andy?
I did spend some time over in Japan. I think I've been there 3 or 4 different times now. A few times to mark pintail ducks with satellite transmitters, and one time we also marked hooper swans as well. It was a really fabulous field work, a really cool project.
Yeah, but some of that first stuff when bird flu hit in '06 was sending those guys over, and that recovery we got of ours. It's happened before. It wasn't the first one, but so guys went over there, and USGS folks over there and marked a whole ton of pintails. And I think in North America now we're up to about 36 of those bands getting shot over here. One cool tidbit is I think I'm the only one that recaptured one of them alive down in Nevada one time. So, that's what's so cool. A lot of this stuff came from just simple chunks of aluminum, or, those are actually Incoley bands they were putting on in Japan. But, instantly we see those pathways, and he mentioned those emperor geese and all these goofy birds. But you get into Beringia, I mean, you got birds western Alaska that are wintering all the way down to Antarctica, and northern wheat ears that go to Africa, and all these bar-tailed godwits. And it's amazing how connected to the whole world Alaska is for bird movements. So yeah, some of these more front and center species are just a select group of birds of lots of them that do this stuff.
Well, you guys knocked it out of the park about describing how waterfowl can be a global vector for something like avian influenza, but perhaps as the host, I overlooked something in that we should probably spend a little bit of time talking about avian influenza. That's a big term, and similar to COVID, there's lots of variation, lots of strains, high path, low path variations, I imagine. A lot of times when we're talking about avian influenza, it's about, I guess, the domestic poultry industry, and the waterfowl concerns are introducing that into, I guess, more of that ag market. But Andy, can you describe avian influenza? Just kind of maybe discuss the variations, the good, the bad, the ugly, and really kind of what we're talking about today.
Sure, Joel. That's a great question. And maybe I want to start by saying that the term avian influenza or bird flu is confusing. And so these terms really refer to an infection of many different hosts with an influenza virus that originates from a bird. So wild birds maintain a broad diversity of influenza viruses. And generally, these influenza viruses don't cause clinical disease among wild birds. These influenza viruses can spill over into domestic poultry, where, again, typically they don't cause disease. Once in poultry, these viruses may continue to be transmitted among poultry, and they sometimes can spill over into wild mammals, say foxes or seals. They can also spill over into domestic mammals, such as pigs. And relatively rare occasions, they can actually spill over into humans. So bird flu or avian influenza can refer to any of these infections. So it really can be confusing, and people use these terms to mean a lot of different things. So I think today we're mostly going to be talking about a particular type of avian influenza. That is a highly pathogenic avian influenza. So this is a specific type, again, of bird flu or avian influenza where viruses are spilled over from wild birds, typically into poultry. And then as they're being maintained among poultry, they continue to evolve and evolve in such a way that they cause disease among domestic birds. That's where the highly pathogenic comes in. So once these influenza viruses develop high pathogenicity, they tend to make domestic birds sick and often cause domestic birds to die. These highly pathogenic avian influenzas were historically maintained only in domestic poultry. That is, prior to 2002, there had been only one detection globally of highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds, specifically in terns in South Africa in 1961. So things have changed. Since 2002, there's been numerous detections of highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds. So this is kind of a new pathway. And again, the pathway that I think we're going to be mostly talking about today. So in this new pathway, when these highly pathogenic viruses get into wild birds, they sometimes cause disease in wild birds and cause birds to be sick or to die, but not always. Sometimes birds become infected by these highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses and appear to be perfectly healthy.
Andy, do you think with domestic birds, I've got chickens here at home. I'm not spring snow goose hunting this year because I'm nervous about my own chickens. But, I know you mentioned before, the naivety of the immune system on these birds. Does it have an impact that a lot of these poultry, I know I ate one of my 9-month roosters a little while ago, and they're impressively tough. I mean, I pressure cookered them and everything, and all of us, when we buy chicken, turkeys and stuff, they're almost all young birds at these farms. You think that's a big factor with how susceptible they are, or how's age play into those?
Boy, that's a really complicated one, Chris, but I'll try to take it. So
I was hoping it would be simple.
So absolutely, I think age and prior exposure certainly influence disease. So I think it depends on many different factors, but I think if a bird has been exposed to avian influenza before, and when I'm saying avian influenza here, maybe I'm talking about these low pathogenic or not highly pathogenic viruses. Those can prime a bird's immune system and help protect them from future infections. So I think that plays a role. I mentioned that there's lots of diversity of avian influenza that's maintained in wild birds. So I think that the strain of influenza that bird might be exposed to in the past likely influences how protected they are against infection or disease from a highly pathogenic virus too. So I think there's lots of different variables. Another one just might be individual heterogeneity. That is, I'm different than you and you're different than Joel. And so we all have slightly different immune systems. And so our immune systems react slightly differently to a pathogen. And I think that's going to be true of birds as well. So I think all these things play a role. So I think certainly a cohort of young, naive, immunologically naive birds is going to react very differently to a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus than a cohort of older birds, particularly older birds that have been exposed previously to avian influenza viruses.
I had some questions. You said that for forever, not the right word, but I'm going to use forever. It was in domestic poultry, and then along came, a detection in a wild population. How are we, or how did we first detect HPAI in wild birds? What was the mechanism for that?
That's a great question, Joel. And I actually feel very fortunate in my career, or maybe unfortunate, as the case may be, to see the sort of evolution of or emergence of a wildlife disease over my career. So again, prior to 2002, there had been only that single detection in terns in South Africa of a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. But in 1996, a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus emerged in domestic geese in Guangdong, China. And this particularly this particular lineage, I'll call it, of influenza has never really gone away. That is, it caused disease among domestic birds in East Asia for numerous years, and then was first detected in wild birds and at a zoo park in 2002 as having spilled over out of domestic birds into free-ranging and wild birds. And after that, this diversity of flu viruses, this lineage of flu viruses, continue to periodically be detected in wild birds, and that has continued over the course of the last 25 years, essentially. So for some reason, this particular lineage of virus has continued to evolve and adapt in such a way that maybe at first it did seem that it was maintained particularly well in wild birds, but it has sort of evolved and mutated such that now it seems to be much better adapted to wild birds, to the point now that it seems that it's readily maintained in wild birds and being spread over geographically vast distances, first in Eurasia and now in North America.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess talking about the domestic birds, I guess I had a couple questions here. So if you look online, you're going to find most of the information that I think someone's going to find is from APHIS, the Animal, Plant, and Health Inspection Service. That would be their jurisdiction. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. Yep.
So there must be, I guess, requirements for testing, regular requirements for testing for poultry farms, things like that?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so there's detection there. So what happens if there's an outbreak? What's the protocol for something like that?
So I'm not a domestic bird guy, so to speak. So I want to first convey that I don't know all the details, but I think the general protocol for domestic birds is depopulation, essentially killing domestic birds that are infected with highly pathogenic avian influenza, and also that may have been exposed within the flock to highly pathogenic avian influenza. And maybe I'll leave it at that for this question.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. So now I think now switching over, and I guess what I'm trying to do here is introduce, you work for the USGS. And so where does this become jurisdiction of the USGS? Is this is the wild versus domestic, I guess, separation? Is that right?
Yes and no. So to be clear, the USDA APHIS also has a role when it comes to wild bird testing for avian influenza, but it's a shared responsibility between USDA and the Department of Interior. So the USGS is within the Department of Interior, so we also have responsibilities for testing birds, wild birds for influenza viruses. And also at the USGS, we conduct lots of research on influenza in wild birds to better understand how birds might maintain and disperse avian influenza viruses.
Okay, wow. So I think kind of moving down the funnel a little bit here in the conversation. And so obviously it's pretty easy to understand then if there's an outbreak in a domestic flock, you're going to lose your flock. But in the wild, are we concerned about, I guess in the past, I've never really heard the conversation being a concern about the integrity of wild populations of ducks and geese. Are we starting to move into that conversation right now, Andy?
I think we are, Joel. And as I was conveying with regard to where things were historically as compared to where they are today, I think we're maybe seeing this evolution happen in real time, if you will. So the first outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza in North America, in wild birds in North America, was only in 2014, 2015. So prior to 2014, there had never been a detection of highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds in North America. That changed in late 2014, and subsequently there was quite a large outbreak in domestic poultry in the United States. That is, more than 50 million birds were affected during that outbreak. Economic costs have been estimated in the billions of dollars during the 2014, 2015. and there were many detections in wild birds. But highly pathogenic avian influenza, as part of that outbreak, was eradicated within domestic birds by the end of 2015. And there was continued detection of highly pathogenic avian influenza in wild birds into 2016. But then things went quiet here in North America until late 2021. And that's where we are now, is this outbreak that started in December of 2021 and is ongoing. As part of the current outbreak, more than 17 million domestic birds have been affected. And as of this morning, the USDA APHIS reports 482 detections among wild birds. So these 482 detections in wild birds is unprecedented.
Okay, so I was going to hop in, it's asking some questions about, how we're learning this stuff. Back when, it was first showing up in the mid-teens there, or a little bit earlier too, it seemed to me we had two things going on. We were hooking up with banding crews, guys out there or folks out there before hunting season, getting all the bands out, getting ready to be able to assess, harvest, things like that. And, we had USDA researchers, Fish and Wildlife Service, everybody out there working together and using Q-tips, both ends of the bird, and getting some samples, putting it in vials, sending them off to labs to get run. But then it was also USDA folks showing up at hunter check stations and stuff and getting these birds. So it was pretty neat. It was a bunch of living, healthy birds that we let go immediately, and then other birds that were happily doing whatever they were doing until they got shot. And that's where things are getting a little bit different now. If you want to carry on, Andy, that's where things are different this time, where we're able to sample birds that are already dead. This is the first time that this has happened in North America. So, what do you think about that stuff?
Those are great points, Chris. So, you hit a couple different important topics there. And, first, just, maybe describing for listeners, reconveying what you already stated, that there's different types of surveillance strategies, more active surveillance strategies where we swab live birds to understand what they might be carrying as part of, capture efforts. And then also, hunter shot birds are part of active surveillance. Those birds typically are apparently healthy prior to getting shot. And then there's passive surveillance where birds are sampled as there's mortality events. And right now, what we're witnessing that's maybe a little bit different than what we've seen in the past is wild bird mortality events where we're detecting highly pathogenic avian influenza. Per your comment in comments in 2014, 2015, most of the detections were in apparently healthy waterfowl that had been shot, and then it turns out they had a highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. And of course, many of the detections as part of the current outbreak are part of active surveillance of hunter shot birds. And so it's been extremely helpful that hunters are making their birds available to the USDA and USGS to swab these birds to understand the prevalence of influenza viruses. But we're also seeing right now that some birds are dying. And this includes waterfowl, which can often be asymptomatic or be infected with highly pathogenic avian influenza, but not show signs of sickness or otherwise seem perfectly healthy. And also some other species too. It seems that a fair number of raptors are being found dead and are turning up highly pathogenic avian influenza positive. So the number of birds being detected right now may not be such that it seems populations are at risk from, at very broad levels. That being said, there are certainly birds that are dying on account of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And I think if these viruses were to get in the wrong population, if you will, threatened or endangered species, that there could be conservation concerns there. So I think we're sort of monitoring, watching the situation, if you will, and seeing what unfolds. But I don't think this situation is such that the risk to avian health is nominal or minimal, if you will. Maybe one last point that I want to offer to listeners is to be aware that when wild birds are dying right now, we can't assume that it's all because of highly pathogenic avian influenza. There is certainly an ongoing outbreak. It is certainly an important thing that we need to follow up on and investigate. But there are also other wildlife diseases occurring in wild birds right now, such as cholera. You mentioned that, Chris. And listeners can find information on other outbreaks that are ongoing right now through the USGS National Wildlife Health Center. They have a Whispers program. And as part of that program, folks can find information online and see what other pathogens and outbreaks might be occurring in their area to better understand what might be affecting the birds in their area and might help to explain what they're seeing.
So currently the sky isn't falling, but our eyes are wide open, looking for issues and maybe safeguarding against issues. So and I guess what you described is there's regular ongoing surveillance of wild and domestic birds, waterfowl and poultry. But then, I guess what we're seeing, Chris and I were talking about this, and, we're starting to see showing up on the internet, social media, just more visuals, videos, still images, and particularly it's snow goose season, right? So there's a lot of white geese that are being picked up and actually more images. Chris, you described one of somebody out snow goose hunting in some sheet water. What was that you saw?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just seeing all kinds of stuff. We even had one of our Delta chapters week and a half ago. They spent some time over by Fargo just watching birds, and then they actually came back the next day, and every single one of them they knew was dead. So yeah, like Andy's point's really good. There's other things they're dying of. There could be cholera. This is, especially with the freeze thaw line, when you get all these bird concentrated, cholera is always a big one. Then we get with these snow geese right now, just crippling loss. And we see it all summer here in North Dakota. We'll have snow geese here that, just weren't found for whatever reason during the spring hunts. But yeah, just so much different stuff. But yeah, the sheetwater one, this one, guys are out in a permanent spread, a place where they're setting decoys and hunting whenever they find the time for like 3 weeks or whatever. And, they're coming out and they had a stack of 100 birds. Some of the stuff I was hearing a couple of weeks ago, similar permanent spreads where, it was a slow day. So noon, 2:00, they packed up their stuff and left all their decoys and went home. And they came out at sunrise the next day. And, there's 10 birds dead laying in the decoys, that weren't cripples or anything like that. And, I think some of these have gotten sent in. I was looking on I think it was one of the USDA sites that, we had one sample right here in the county that Joel and I are sitting in right now. So things are popping up, but, it sounds like some samples are getting sent in. Not, I think it'd be good to make it clear too, that not every bird gets sent in. We have no interest in that, but, the few samples that have been getting picked up, it's flushing up the flyway this spring,
Andy, when a bird is infected with HPAI, obviously it's not, from perfect health to instant death. What are some of the physical expressions for people that are out there wondering?
Great question. Again, Joel. The effects of highly pathogenic avian influenza on wild birds can be extremely variable. So some birds, especially the dabbling ducks, can be asymptomatic, meaning that they appear to be perfectly healthy. Other birds can show signs of disease, but then recover. And those signs of disease may include a general lack of coordination, stumbling, inability to stand upright, inability to fly, swimming in circles, a twisted neck, or paralysis. So individuals of the same species can also be differentially affected by highly pathogenic avian influenza. So, for example, some snow geese may appear completely healthy, where other snow geese infected by highly pathogenic avian influenza may become sick. And then, of course, some birds die because of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And if numerous birds die during a relatively short interval at the same general location, that's typically referred to as a mortality event. And these mortality events can be significant. As part of a recent mortality event in Israel, approximately 8,000 cranes are estimated to have died. And another mortality event involving barnacle geese in the United Kingdom, as many as 16,000 birds may have died. So it can be quite variable, and it's maybe prudent for folks just to be looking for things out of the ordinary. I think most hunters spend a lot of time afield and have a pretty good sense of what's normal. And I think often, or at least sometimes, manifestation of highly pathogenic avian influenza might just appear as something abnormal as far as bird behavior.
So it's not unlike any other virus that's in the world. Some are asymptomatic, don't suffer at all, don't show any symptoms. Some have mild symptoms to severe, up to and including death. So it's not necessarily a death sentence. So I guess the big question here is that North America is a really big place, right? And you probably are unable to speak to this one completely, but so someone's in South Dakota, someone's in North Dakota, someone's hunting in Saskatchewan. What do you, I think the initial reaction is I should collect these birds and I should send them somewhere. What's the rule of thumb on that one, or what's the advice that you would give?
Sure. Another great question, Joel. You're hitting it out of the park today. So I think the most important thing is to contact the land manager of the area where a person is hunting. So, if you're at a state refuge of some sort, contact the state management agency in charge of that land. If it's a federal wildlife refuge, contact the office of that wildlife refuge. If it's a private land, contact the landowner, or if you are the landowner, then maybe think about contacting the state veterinary office or the provincial veterinary office. So most agencies have a protocol for how to handle mortality events. And so you want to make sure that you're communicating to the land manager and following their protocol. And as you state, their protocol might involve not responding, and that's important. I appreciate that many people want to help, and I think that's great, but also we want to make sure that birds are handled in a way that it's not actually causing more harm. That is, sometimes moving a carcass or moving sick birds might help move the virus to a new area. And so it's important to know exactly how to respond before responding, just to be sure that something unanticipated and actually harmful doesn't occur.
How is the virus transmitted or passed from one bird to another?
Avian influenza viruses are generally transmitted via a fecal-oral route, so through contaminated water. I think bird-to-bird contact is another means by which viruses may be spread among birds. And then I think these avian influenza viruses can also be transmitted via the jargon term is fomites, so through an inanimate object. So if some object, a vehicle or waders becomes contaminated with the virus, and then that object is moved to a new area, it could be deposited elsewhere. So that's maybe something that hunters might want to think about when thinking about moving vehicles or moving waders or gear between an area where they maybe saw an outbreak event or sick or dead birds, and before going to a new area.
So it sounds like, if you're encountering dead birds, ask before you do anything. And maybe gathering them all up and hiking them out of the field isn't the best way to go. Is that kind of maybe a rule of thumb there?
That seems like a good rule of thumb, is to really get information prior to responding.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah. So go ahead, Chris.
I've looked around quite a bit, and here in North Dakota, Andy was hitting it dead on. Don't make the problem bigger. Don't fill up your truck and drive around thinking you're going to find someone that wants them. North Dakota, one of the easiest sites I found, and they're just have an online reporting system. Tell us where you see them, and then you can kind of forget about it and carry on with your life and let them follow their protocols. I fully agree with that. You don't want to move it around. I mean, you might have a friend that has domestic backyard flocks and all that. Because what would you call that? Fromites? That
Fomite. Yep.
Fomite.
Yeah.
So there's think about it, the biosecurity that they're enacting with all this commercial poultry. I mean, even in the best of times, I don't know if all the public are familiar with it, but I hang out with a lot of aviculturists. I've been at commercial farms. I just kind of hang out with that crowd. But even then, they're wearing booties and dipping feet and everything into a solution to kill that stuff, before you can even go into these facilities. So, that's how important it is to the commercial industry that, maybe some hunters should think of how those guys are treating it. And if you're, carrying out a game strap with a bunch of birds and, they're been wet and they're banging against your waders, you're contaminating some other things. And another thing I was thinking about too, that Andy brought up is, keep in mind, a lot of these government agencies are still closed. So it would be hard to physically find someone, over at Long Lake National Wildlife Refuge here, so don't even bother, because you might not even find people, because there's still a lot of government places closed,
Yeah, it sounds like, from recent travel, a sign comes to mind: see something, say something. And so, yeah, if you see something out in the field, if you see, an area with dead birds, yeah, it's, try to run that phone tree, whether your state game and fish office, Andy, like you said, a refuge or a state wildlife management area, reach out. This is I guess it's an emerging issue. It's a large enough issue that call someone and they're going to be able to pass you on. So see something, say something, leave the birds in the field. I guess now moving into hunting, it's spring snow goose hunting right now. There's people out there with giant spreads traveling across the country, hunting spring snow geese on their way back to their Arctic breeding grounds or nesting grounds. What precautions should a hunter take, if you're able to comment on that, Andy?
Yeah, sure, Joel. So I think you're asking, with regard to precautions to protect one's own health. Do I interpret that correctly?
That's actually kind of a two-part there. Maybe we've kind of buried this one, and perhaps there's people that have stuck onto this podcast long enough to say, okay, is it a danger to me? So maybe we'll break that into two parts. One, I guess, to not be further a part of the problem of spreading it, even if it's an asymptomatic bird. But what about one's personal health? I guess crossover, you mentioned before, in other avian influenza strains, crossover into mammals has been documented. What about this? Or should hunters be concerned for their own health?
Great query. So first, I want to start by saying that the CDC is the lead agency for human health. So I encourage all listeners to look online. The CDC has a great website that has information on avian influenza. I was just on there earlier today, in fact. So currently, the CDC believes the health risk is to the general public is low from the current outbreak. To date, there has not been any human cases in North America associated with the current outbreak. I think that's an important piece of information. And if we consider viruses that are close related globally, I'm only aware of a single human infection with a virus similar to what's currently in wild birds in North America. And that was a person that did not have any symptoms and that raised birds, and his domestic birds were infected. So there's not a tremendous amount of evidence that this current outbreak is has important implications to human health, at least as I understand it from the CDC website. It's also maybe important to know that when I had mentioned before prior exposures of humans or prior infections of humans with avian influenza, that those infections are typically people that have had close, prolonged, and unprotected exposure to infected poultry. So avian influenza generally only affects people with these sort of poultry exposures. And I want to point out that these are generally rare instances. That is, human infections with avian influenza are uncommon. The USDA has some really good information on their website when it comes for how hunters can protect themselves. Some pieces of advice that I've gotten from the USDA website, I think are kind of common sense. It's things like not to eat, drink, or smoke in the field when hunting, to not harvest or handle wild birds that are obviously sick or that a hunter finds dead, and to wash one's hands with soap and water after hunting and handling birds.
Well, I put you in the hot seat. Andy, I do need to, if there's someone that I should pass on these flattering words, let me know to help you with your job. But you've sat in the hot seat and you're prepared and you're giving great answers. And, there's, we're not expecting anybody to have all the answers to put someone's neck on the line. But at the same time, I think, as the Duck Hunters Organization, as we call ourselves, the Waterfowl Hunters Organization, maybe in this case of talking a lot about geese today, it's, we did really want to help people understand this issue. It's changing. And I think we will put on, our social media feeds in connection to this podcast. If it's okay, Andy, we'll pull a bunch of those websites, web links from you, and we'll push them out, to our listeners and supporters so they can stay engaged in that issue. So from a health standpoint, very, very low risk, and some great tips there on maybe some precautions that you could take if you're interested in taking those precautions. I think there's probably a lot of people out there that probably aren't too worried about it, and I think the science would support that. But if someone does want to take some precautions, by all means, do that and arm yourself with some of the information that Andy mentioned, and we'll share with the group there. But now, so you're a hunter, so I guess that kind of covers that as well. You harvest birds. What are some of the steps that you take with your own field equipment when you're out doing testing? So if you're out there in waders, you're out there in other clothes, do you wash them down with certain types of solutions afterwards?
As for myself, like as a personal hunter, I do tend to wash down my waders at home and the like. I tend to be cognizant of how my vehicle is as far as how I'm accessing different wetland areas. That is, if I'm driving down dirt roads and actually in the wetlands, or if I'm, staying in parking lots where my vehicle is unlikely to come in contact with potentially contaminated water, et cetera, and washing it as appropriate. When I'm working in the field, I'm very cognizant about the condition of a truck driving between sites, et cetera.
Okay. No, that sounds good. So, Chris, you've been very heavily involved in Arctic research, banding efforts, and so this is probably something that you can relate to. But I guess I still have to ask this question to Andy, being on the front lines, is, banding, remote banding, in Alaska and in Arctic regions of Canada, that's a really important population monitoring tool. Will there be any interruptions to those efforts this year that have been considered?
So, Joel, I can't directly answer that question, but I'm going to do my best to give some more information to you and listeners. So I want to clarify that the USGS is not a management agency. We're a research agency. So our role is to generate information for management agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Park Service or state partners to use so that it can help them to make informed management decisions. And so I think what you're asking about is really management decisions. So I do know that there is conversations among land management agencies of how to proceed with banding operations and research in the upcoming field season, given the potential for actions to make this outbreak worse. That is, when we think about many banding operations require baiting of birds and congregation of birds. And there is some evidence in the literature that by having birds congregate over bait, that it could increase the prevalence of avian influenza. So I think management agencies are taking pieces of information such as this and carefully considering whether or not it makes sense for them to continue to pursue such efforts during an outbreak. Also weighing, the importance of these research and management activities. So I think it's kind of a complicated calculus, and it may depend on the state or the agency how they proceed or not proceed this year.
No, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something I'm definitely interested in. That paper that came out, it was interesting. It compared, people were swabbing birds based on the method of capture. So they had a bunch of baited birds, which you have to pre-bait and they keep coming and going, and then you close your traps or shoot a net over them or whatever. And then they are comparing, I think, to night lighting, right? Where people hang over the front of a boat in the dark at night and blind birds with lights and catch them one by one. Those, you're assuming those birds haven't been concentrated before capture, where the other birds have been concentrated during your pre-baiting efforts, also before capture. And it was interesting. I think it was, what was it, like 2.5 times prevalence or infection rate versus the two methods. And that's even before we start pushing them into crates, and handling them. So, I'm fully cognizant that people are very alert this year. Canadian Wildlife Service has already been talking about, no bait trapping. But, it's so different than what we've done in the past, does shoving them in crates. And we always do it humanely, but, you get the birds in there and get a certain number of birds where there's enough that they don't have enough shoulder room, and it kind of calms them, and you wonder, is there concern? I don't think we can answer it yet, of even just as simple as putting them in banding crates is going to help spread this more. I mean, I found it really interesting that we're already influencing it by a factor of 2.5,
And following up to what Chris said there, I maybe want to emphasize that there's lots of unknowns here. And maybe that, Joel, you'd asked me a question about what I do as a hunter and also how we proceed with regard to capture events and sampling events. And maybe I just want to convey that as we're in sort of a bit of an unknown circumstance and the data that we have is, I think, decent, but it's certainly not complete. And so, and there's lots of different scenarios here to think about. Are we talking about, something that might be wet or something that might be muddy, and, what concentration of birds and at what concentration of bait? And there's so many variables here that we're not flying blind, so to speak, but we're also not flying with complete information. And so there's lots of unknowns here. And so I just want to convey that I think people are doing their best to make prudent decisions and decisions that are likely best for the resource, but it's also making these decisions without knowing exactly all the different pieces on the landscape and how they interplay with one another.
Yeah, these are changing times, and I guess you take all the complications, the field complications, directly as a result of COVID. Now you blend it into this. So it's a constantly evolving situation and discussion. But Andy, I always think that it's kind of fun when there's something going on in the world. I always like to ask an expert how they live their personal life, because it does tend to give you some really insight if you see someone in an expert situation just being super casual about their own care. You tend to take more comfort and follow suit. But I guess we just probably have a few minutes left of this discussion. Is either one of you guys, is there anything that you'd like to bring up that you think we missed here?
I got one more. I think Andy'd be perfect for this one. Looking at these aphis sites, and the birds we've been talking about, they're obvious birds. There's been the black vultures, wild black vultures detected at zoos so far, bald eagles, or a white snow goose. I went to Minneapolis last week for a concert, and just driving down the interstate, I saw 12 white glowing birds out in a snow-free field. What do you think about the other birds, Andy? What do we know about, I'm more of I like all birds. I'm a birder before I'm a hunter. And, what about the birds that are hard to see? I mean, what do we know about non-waterfowl birds? I mean, should we be concerned, even a cryptic duck dying, and washing into Phragmites, or a robin, or, 3 months from now, we're going to have these South American shorebirds showing up. And what do we know about non-waterfowl birds? And can you give us a little blurb about the other birds?
Sure. An outstanding question there, Chris. So here's another case where our information is certainly incomplete. So what we do know about effects of these highly pathogenic virus on other birds are typically determined through what's called a challenge study, where a small number of birds in captivity are exposed to a virus, and researchers assess potential health effects. And so for raptors, it seems that they seem highly susceptible to these highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses. And I think you're seeing some of that on the USDA detections that are posted online. That is, you reference vultures, bald eagles, hawks, owls, for what might be a variety of reasons. They seem really susceptible to disease and death. And so I think sick and dead raptors are something that have certainly occurred in recent weeks and months, and something that I anticipate may continue over weeks and months. As part of this current outbreak, there's also been some detections in shorebirds. As some listeners may know, shorebirds sometimes have these low pathogenic or more common avian influenza viruses. So it's maybe not surprising that these birds are infected at some level. But in the past, we haven't seen much, or in North America, any mortality among shorebirds. So I think that's kind of an interesting finding, and something that I'm definitely keeping an eye out in the future. Something else that you mentioned, Chris, that I think is interesting and for listeners to think about, and that's potential biases in the data that we do have. That is, right now, aside from snow geese, there's not much or any hunting occurring. And so some snow geese that are being hunted are being tested for influenza viruses, highly pathogenic influenza viruses. But these more passive surveillance techniques, that is finding sick and dead birds, rely on these birds being found. And so when we think of birds that have dull plumage, brown plumage, the detection of these birds might be relatively low. And so it's possible that we're getting a pretty biased viewpoint on what's actually happening to different species of birds across the landscape. So I think these were great points that you raised.
Chris, you're full of good points, but I get the award for the best questions today. So good. The best points award, best question award. Andy, hands down, you get the best answer award. This has been a good 1, 2, 3 punch, if there is such a thing. Hey, I think we're going to move this one down to the end here. Andy, can I just, if this is a fast changing world, in a month or 2 or 3, if the world is changing, can we reach back out to you to maybe have an update discussion?
Absolutely. I do really embrace the opportunity. It's been great fun to talk with you two today, and I hope listeners find some of this information useful.
Okay, I think you found your calling. You've done a really great job. So, but hey, I guess if there are questions, this podcast does have a dedicated email address, podcast@deltawaterfowl.org. You can send questions, ask questions of me, of Chris, of Andy. Rather than give out your email address, Andy, we'll just go that route and I can forward them to you. But hey, I can't thank you enough. I hope you guys have a great spring and summer, and let's stay in touch. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andy.
All right. See you, gentlemen.